Warren, can you hear me back there? Yeah, I can hear it in the mic.
Yeah, they sing in Italian. And
I didn't know that came up. I guess it does. It didn't. I'm just too strong. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I asked Matt if he'd say a prayer for us to start. Remember to keep the Keiths and Bells in your prayers. If you didn't see the email, Linda Bell passed away today. If you didn't see my email, Heath is doing good after his MRI. He had a little trouble with nausea from the anesthesia, but he's doing good. Are there any other prayer requests before we get started? Anything to keep in mind? All right, go ahead, Matt.
Lord God, Lord, we thank you for the blessing it is to be here right now. Lord, what a blessing it is for the moments when we feel inept and ill-prepared, Lord, that we can look to your word as an encouragement, but not only that, but that you've supplied us with a family and brothers in the faith to lift us up. Lord, as we see examples, young and old, Lord, we pray that we take note of them and, Lord, that we realize what a blessing it is. Lord, we pray your healing hand be on the Keith and Bell families. Lord, we know that they have grief and mourning to do, and Lord, we pray that you be with them each step of the way, Lord, and that they can find peace in you. We're so grateful for Keith's MRI going well. Lord, we pray that answers are found and that those that are taking care of him can alleviate his issue as quickly as they can. We pray for the many that are sick, Lord, and we know that you are a good Father that provides care and provides a steady hand. Lord, may we always look to that when we need it. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Okay, so we're continuing with our theme for the year that JD came up with. It's the several of the let us statements, right? So if you remember so far this year, we've done let us draw near, let us put on the armor of light, let us love one another, let us press on to maturity, let us be thankful, and then last month was let us walk by the Spirit. We had some good classes on these. I'm sure there's several other along those same vein that we'll have good studies about later in the year. But this month is a little bit different. It was a let us not statement or a negative statement. So there's only one on the list that was kind of more of a let's not do this, right? And when I signed up for this one, I remember thinking I had a really good point about this that I wanted to share, and I don't remember what that point was. I didn't write it down. But I do remember that I had a point, so maybe one of y'all will make it. So what I thought we'd do tonight, this comes from 1 Corinthians 10, verses 8 and 9. What I thought we'd do is look at verse 8 and look at the example that Paul gives us in verse 8, and then same thing for verse 9. And we'll look at just the general context of those and how it all fits together and just some takeaways and some strategies and tactics from there. So if you would turn to 1 Corinthians 10 if you're not there, and let's, if someone would mind reading verse 8.
You must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day.
Yeah, so your translation actually used, was it sexual immorality that yours used? Yeah, so mine just said immorality, right? And the Strong's number here is 4203, which the root word is porne, right? Which is literally to commit fornication, to act a harlot, or to indulge unlawful lust. So it's definitely in the context of a sexual sin, but there's also kind of a broader spiritual sense, right? A lot of the minor prophets will talk about Israel, being unfaithful to the Lord, right? And using this as an analogy for instead of giving God what's due him, giving it to something or someone else, right? So to an idol or that sort of thing. So there's kind of this general concept of idolatry associated with this topic, but I definitely think we're talking about the sexual sense here, which obviously it's an uncomfortable topic, right? I'm not really enjoying talking about this up here. But it's an important topic, especially for us men, right? Us men that we're striving to be like Jesus, we're trying to be more like Jesus, we're trying to be useful in his kingdom, we're trying to be pleasing to him. I don't think it's just useful for young men, right? Even though they certainly have this can be especially difficult when you're young, right? You have raging hormones, right? You have it just bombarded around you, right? But we also need to remember it's good for us not so young people as well. I was trying to look up the exact age David was when he sinned with Bathsheba, but he wasn't a teenager or a youth, right? He definitely wasn't in his 20s, right? So it's definitely applicable to all of us, and so I want to think about that specifically tonight, but also the broader sense of other ways that we can be immoral just generally, or immoral against God, right? We're idolatrous, where we're betraying God. And so that's kind of the main concept in verse 8. And I think the example he gives, I believe it's from Numbers 25, if you want to turn over there, Numbers 25. Numbers 25, and if someone would read verses 1 through 9.
Now Israel remained in the acacia grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was roused against Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor." And indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000.
And so if you'll notice here, it says 24,000. In 1 Corinthians 10, it says 23,000 in one day. It seems like 23,000 in one day, but total it was 24,000. So I don't think there's a discrepancy there. But I do think this is what it's referring to, right? You see them joining themselves to these Midianite women, to these Moabite women, and it becomes a detestable thing, right? I didn't, of the numbers I saw of plagues and destruction that Israel endured on their journey, wandering through the wilderness, this is the biggest number I found. There's sometimes they were destroyed and a number's not given, but it seems like this was the biggest number, the biggest loss of life for their sins that was given. There may have been more, but and I may be wrong about that. Who knows? But it sounds good, right? So if you find the bigger number, let me know. It was kind of hard to search for, but yeah. So this was a big deal. And does anybody happen to remember, at what point in their wandering did this happen? Was it towards the beginning, towards the end? How close was this? And I'm sorry, I had the printout of just the questions that I left at home, so let's just be glad I made it here intact. So I'm sorry, but you would have had these ready where you could have seen them before. But anybody know? Anybody want to make a guess? The end. It's towards the end, right? So Aaron had died at this point. This is one of the last events before Moses dies. And so that was kind of surprising to me that they would have this big problem, big loss there towards the end, right? After they had been, a lot of the previous generation had been dying off, right? So it does seem that it's towards the end of their wandering. And so that's kind of interesting to think about, right? Because you wonder how many of these people saw all the events, right, that from the Exodus coming on, right? But what do you think, what are some things that you think they would have had to have forgotten to participate in this with the Midianite women? What were some of the events from their past? Like, just it comes to your mind immediately, like, I feel like that would be hard to do knowing that they saw this, or they, at least one generation away, heard about this. Any other events from their wandering that come to mind?
Well, right at the beginning, when the golden calf, they killed like about several thousand.
Yeah,
Well, that day, the next day at the latest. So
yeah, several.
at the beginning, and here we are at the end, still the kind of same mentality of not really doing what's right.
Right, yeah, several thousand were killed. Yeah, you would think they'd be quite fearful of it.
I never really thought the children of Israel were rehabilitated. When they didn't get to go in, we know why they didn't get to go in. God was so angry, he let them all die off, except the youngest, the ones who weren't responsible for the decisions that kept them out. And so you've got these parents and grandparents who are abhorrent in their behavior, raising over the next 40 years a generation that probably didn't learn any better than they learned. And so I never thought of the people that were able to finally go into the land as being rehabilitated. I think we like to believe that, but I just honestly don't think they were. So it's not surprising to me at the end.
Yeah,
They are doing what the people around them and in the land they're going to are doing, hence the admonitions they later had to have. Of, listen to me, and it will go well with you in there. Don't listen to me, and you will suffer.
right. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, just a few chapters back in number 16, we read about the rebellion that Korah led against Moses. The people were able to see God actually judge between them, and to see, we're told to back away from those conspirators, and the ground swallowed them up. And yet somehow they forget about that, and they think that over here in 23 they're going to get away with doing what they're doing.
Yeah,
People have short memories. So if 2 days ago you split the camp up and said, oh, you guys were bad and we'll kill you all with fire, boom. Okay, chances are 3 days from there, you're not going to do anything. That's fresh in your memory. But you can read through there, these purges, they weren't happening every day, every week.
right.
They were spread out. They got to a boiling point. The Lord was fed up with it and did something. A lot of time that went in between some of those things. Chances are people were getting away with this in respect, like not being caught or called out on it.
Right.
So it's like, well, God must not really be paying attention because this stuff is happening and nobody's getting, burned up or swallowed up in the ground. So I'll take my stab at it too, right?
Right.
You just basically, you're rolling the dice at that point. I'm hoping he's not watching because it looks like he's not.
Yeah,
So
yes, sir.
First Corinthians 10 kind of talks about a few things that they all would have experienced. Under the cloud, pass through the sea, eat the same spiritual food, drink the same spiritual drink, talking about all things that they had experienced. I think in particular, they were under the cloud, like even in the wilderness, there's a cloud. As they go off and engage in sexual morality, there's an indicator of God's presence.
Yeah, it's right there. But I guess they get used to just that being there. That's just the normal, right? So things just get forgotten.
And one thing that happens too, and this is just the idea of having short memories, we tend to think that we're the exception. That somebody else's sin is really bad, but even if I do the same thing, I've got a good reason for it. And it wasn't that it was just a few people too, it was 23,000 that failed, And so they had a lot of other people doing the same thing. And usually you, unfortunately, feel safe in numbers. When, if you're following a crowd, the Bible tells you not to follow a crowd, but do evil. And I think, though, that idea of thinking that we're somehow different than others, because I don't know what else could have been going through their minds.
Yeah.
That's a really good principle. It's common to humanity. It doesn't matter whether it was at the beginning of time or today. We have that tendency. And everything but what I do is worse. And that's why you hear the expression, well, it's not like I killed anybody. That's the only thing we all agree on is abhorrent. Everything else is shades of gray.
Yeah.
And I gotta believe the Israelites looked at all of this the same way. Because they were as human as we are. And humanity, as Solomon says, doesn't change from generation to generation. It stays the same.
Any other thoughts on that one? Let's see. Okay, so I want to think a little bit about Moab and Midian. I meant to, this is one of those things I wish I had time to look up. I'm not quite sure what the difference was. Sometimes it'll say Moab and sometimes it'll say Midianite women. I don't think they were the same, but maybe they were. I meant to look more into that. But how did this group treat the Israelites different than the other nations around them did? So when the Israelites would come up to one of the borders, what would typically happen? What would most of the nations do? Or like if they asked if they could cross through. Anybody remember?
They wouldn't allow it. A lot of times they want to fight.
Yeah, they'd send their army out. So like Edom, God didn't let them take out the Edomites, but they went around the Amorites on the other side. They did that, and God let them annihilate them, right? So most of the time, it was just a direct front, right? That these nations would put up to block and to stop the Israelites. But this group, they had a little bit different tactic, and so obviously that was that they would send these women in there to entice them out, to entice them to come obviously with sexual purposes, but also idolatry too. And does anybody remember whose idea that was? It actually tells us who came up with that plan.
It was Balaam, because
Yeah.
he told Balak that this is how you could get them by sending these women in there. And that's in Revelations 2:14. He gives us that information.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know. I missed that one. It's also in Numbers 31:16 as well. It talks about Balaam was killed with them because this is several chapters later when they attack him and do take him out. But they kill Balaam as well because he gave this idea, right? And what else? Can somebody give me just a summary of some of the other events of Balaam that we know from this book? You kind of hit on some, right? Balak sends for him, and then what else? What else happens there?
Well, he's trying to get him to curse the Israelites, and he wouldn't do it, but you get the backstory how he actually almost squirrely like he tells them
Yeah.
the way he can do it without doing it. So
Yeah, it's squirrely. That's a good term for it, right? It's just very, very slimy, right? Like he's not gonna curse him, but he still wants that money, right? He still wants to help them, and so he kind of slips him some information, right? Why do you think this was such an effective plan? Because it was pretty effective, right? It killed 24,000 of them. Had the best chance of stopping them as anybody else. Had a better chance.
A lot of times we think that God has to punish us, and that's what he wanted. He wanted God to, he wanted them to be cursed so that God would actually do it. A lot of times you don't have to have God doing it. We're pretty good about doing it ourselves. And so he tried to turn God against the people, but it's a lot easier to turn people against God than it is God against us.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Derek?
I mean, going back to where you started in 1 Corinthians 8, it's talking about fleeing fornication. El Yor, Balaam, they were all, I mean, that's the god of fertility. They were, prostitution ran rampant in that culture with Moab and the women, and we see over and over again the effectiveness and the sin of fornication in their lives and our lives and every generation between us. So, I mean, he appealed to their physical nature with women.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so that's kind of my next question. So how can sexual immorality, how can it weaken a nation? How can it weaken a congregation? How can it weaken a family? And how can it weaken you? Answer those in whatever order for your friend that you would like. How about a nation? How can it weaken a nation?
We're doing a pretty good job of it in this country right now.
Yeah, we're seeing it rapidly happen right now.
It is, you thought, I remember my parents talking in the 60s about the hippie movement and the things we observed driving through Aspen and in New York where we lived. And my parents were just like, things can't get any worse than this. Oh my word. How much worse did they get over the next generation or two? And then look where we are today, where they are advocating for any and everything and undermining all morality and sense of morality. And if we think it can't get any worse, remember why God destroyed the world with flood. Because I have to believe it was worse then than it is now, or else we are as bad off as they were then, and God help us. It may not destroy us with flood, but so I think the nation's doing a really good job of going down the wrong path that history has taught us is never going to work out.
Yeah.
It changes focus from a group or a unity perspective to a individual perspective. You know, when the country was founded and started, everybody was, for the most part, bonded together, striving to make the U.S. something great. But as you go and more individual things creep in, sexual immorality one, right? Now it takes my focus off the whole and what the group of people were trying to achieve. I'm just going to focus on my specific need, and that just keeps peeling away from that group effort to move you in a particular direction. You know, like in this congregation, we're all striving to go this route, but if something creeps in here and peels a couple of people off, then all of a sudden, instead of 200 people marching toward the same thing, it's 150. And then it just starts tearing it apart because you're no longer unified.
Yeah.
I think the story of Samson encompasses all of those. But like you were saying, it takes your focus off. But you compromise what you were supposed to. He took a vow, and then he compromises that vow, and then becomes blinded to what's actually happening. And we start playing a game. And with us, we start playing a game with God. It's the, I'm not as bad, or we start playing a different game. He was playing the game with Delilah until it finally got him. But, I think we go from compromise to blind to death.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of our, especially in a nation, it makes some of our worst vices almost like a valuable commodity. I mean, the hot topic of elections is abortion. It makes a nation think that murdering a baby is okay because you don't want consequences of the sin.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we fund our school system with, gambling and alcohol and cigarettes, some of our worst vices, and yet that's what we use to fund our education. I mean, it really makes us look backward. I honestly think that people are going to look back at us in 100 years or more and think that we were the most barbaric people ever walked the face of the earth because of the millions that's been killed. And whenever whenever you're able to do that, to take, like Derek was talking about, that physical desire that you have, and put it on a national scene for the whole nation. I mean, out in front of the White House, when you had the activism that was going on there, and it's being promoted, and then Christians excuse it as well. I mean, Satan is very good at what he does, and he's tearing apart a nation, not just because of the nation, it's also because of Christians. And that's when it's so bad, is that we don't have to have God destroy us. We're doing a pretty good job of ourselves.
Yeah. Derek?
Well, I mean, look at what the children of Israel went through with divorce, and Moses' commandment of divorce, looking forward to Jesus and him having to clarify, because of the hardness of your hearts, these things were given, but it wasn't always so. And you look at the absolute destruction that divorce can cause a nation, family, children. As somebody that sadly is divorced, I've seen it firsthand, unfortunately, how much destruction can come from setting aside God's law of marriage.
Yeah. Charlie?
Yeah, I was just gonna add that fornication ultimately will destroy a nation because it violates the sanctity of marriage and waters that down, and just like we're seeing happening in our country, they're trying to basically do away with a nuclear family, which is the bedrock of a society. And once we've lost that integrity, then there's just no stopping it, and we're actually seeing that unfold before our eyes.
Yeah, and it didn't start, like, we're kind of seeing the unraveling now, but it started back when, it really started with no-fault divorce, right? Once marriage is no longer a tightly bound covenant that you're not to leave, then that just opens the floodgates for everything, and you just kind of see one domino after another from there. Yes, sir.
You asked from nation to self, to person. I don't think most men, it's not unique to men, but it's especially true for men, understand that the actions, the decisions you make to partake in that sin are like any other sin, and we tend to not see it in the other manifestations of sin as easily as this one and a few others manifest themselves. But it becomes insatiable. You think that satisfying yourself in the wrong way is the end, and it is not.
Yeah.
Whatever you become familiar with is insufficient, and you've got to go beyond that. There was a police officer who did a presentation probably 30 years ago now, talking about how the men who would look at Playboy then cheat on their spouses with hookers were ultimately found years down the road doing abominable things we wouldn't even speak of in this room. And he gave very explicit examples. And nobody sees that transition from this to that. Doesn't always go there. It has a different timeline for everyone. But too often, it is not just a dabbling in something any more than lying doesn't lead to more lying, and drinking doesn't lead to more drinking, and on it goes.
Yeah.
You don't have a little bit of greed. You start with a little bit of greed, but you end up with a whole lot of greed.
Right. Yeah. Here, let me get Craig real quick.
Well, I couldn't help but think about the process that we're talking about, that Paul describes it in Romans 1, when he talks about the Gentiles, that having the evidence of being able to know God, and yet, this is where it all started, was that instead they chose not to even be thankful for God and what He had done, which is everything that we have to be thankful for. But what did that immediately lead to? And he goes into discussing sexual immorality. What it led to, God gave them up. God didn't cause them to do it. It's because they rejected Him, and it led to a debased immorality, and it was all, men with men, and that whole picture there is so concise to what we're witnessing in our, there's been a couple of people have described what we're witnessing today, but it's where we'll go if we choose to not be thankful to God, for
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. There's another hand over here.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that, God says it's a sin against your own body.
Yeah.
I mean, so we engage in that, and it comes insatiable, as Brad said, and we're feeding ourselves cancer we don't even realize.
Yeah, well, and it kind of reminds me with what you were saying, Shane, like you might kind of start down that path and there's no immediate consequences necessarily, you know what I mean? But then it just builds and builds and builds, if you don't come back. Yes, sir.
Eric, you earlier pointed out David and Bathsheba, and I like that example because it points out the fact that I'm sure he justified that in his mind, but then that lie, that sin caused another sin, and on down the road, and all of a sudden he's committing murder, and it's pointed out to him, and he just goes ballistic, like this guy in this example, kill him, and then he realizes, wait, I'm that guy. And just how that one sin leads to another. And if you thought about it at the very beginning, there's no way he would be thinking, I'm going to be committing murder by the end of this.
Right.
But your mind gets so clouded, and you're just justified.
Yeah. Anything else on that? So I wanted to talk a little bit about, we kind of have an especially challenging time in our age, right? These things in microdoses are available like everywhere, right? It's not just online, it's on billboards, it's on, anywhere. It is an easy trap to fall into, right? And so, how can we resist this with it just so prevalent around us? I was thinking about, you kind of mentioned this, Bobby, like we kind of have a sliding scale sometimes with it, like, well, I'm not all the way over here, so what I'm doing over here, it's okay. It's not like that over there. It kind of makes you feel better about it. It looks a little better in your mind, right? How do we deal with this?
It's really hard to be dabbling in these things when you're sitting there also reading the Word of God.
Yeah. A lot of times it's chosen over that, right?
So whether it be keeping yourself busy with other things that really make it impossible to do that, or when those urges pop up, having that automatic go-to, okay, I've got a passage that I'm going to read, and focus and study or prayer, or having that individual that you go to talk to them, that they're able to support you.
Yeah. Brian?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, just accountability, confessing our sins to one another, and if you have that struggle and that challenge, let it be known to someone you trust, or definitely a brother, your wife, or whomever it may be, so you can be held accountable. And obviously the Word of God is huge, and then prayer as well.
Yeah.
Well, it all starts with yourself. I mean, if you don't think you have a problem, you're never gonna face it.
Right.
If I can feel okay watching, the Cowboys cheerleaders, on Sunday before every commercial break comes on, there's the Cowboys cheerleaders, and I'm okay with that, and then those lead something else, and I think all those things are fine in my life, and I can keep digesting and never be affected, then I'm never gonna face the problem. I'm never gonna go to the scripture to see what the problem is, because I've never looked introspectively at what the actual problem is for me.
Yeah.
Being aware of your weak spots, right? There's times where me and Terry want to go out and go do certain things, and we'll actually have to talk about, like, don't think we should go, because I know we'll get there that we're going to see, you know, great example, we're going to go see kids that are playing high school baseball. We know the kids, it's great, we're going to go. Girls are basically naked all in the stands, and like, just right out in front of you. And about the only way you could not notice would be to put your head in your hand and not look. And so what do? Don't go. Somebody says, hey, would you go? No, probably not. Because maybe that's a weakness for me, right? That's causing me a problem. And it's like, I know that, so try to avoid it. But yeah, Derek's right. If you ignore the fact that you have the urges or this weakness, you won't do anything about it, and it'll just get worse. You'll put yourself in the wrong kind of situation eventually.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's easy, especially as we're talking about the nation, to think about what everybody else is doing wrong, how terrible it is. We got verse 12, that maybe the Corinthians were thinking the same thing. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And I think that, we can't make any allowance for sexual immorality of any kind.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so dangerous for anyone. We can't think on our past even and think, oh, I used to struggle so much, and now I'm so much better. Right? I mean, it's just one day, 23,000 people at the edge of the promised land. He says, like, they all died. They didn't make it.
Yeah.
It's just so easy. We have to fight it.
Eddie?
Yeah, I like when Trey said, no allowances.
Yeah.
Job 31:1, Job said, I've made a covenant with my eyes. And I think that's where the key is maybe that's where it starts, is we have to cut off the action, for sure. And a lot of the things that our brothers will continually encourage are things that cut off that action. But at the end of the day, you're still going to be alone from time to time. And you're still going to be around some things that can be temptations from time to time. If those things aren't pulled up by the roots, they're just going to grow back. And so, the idea of no allowances is, when Paul talked about the works of the flesh, he said, and the like. Anything that's like that, you have to stay away from. Anything that's like that, you can't give yourself over to. Proverbs talks about, don't even go down that road. You have no business going over there. There's no reason for you to be there. Proverbs 6 tells you that, verse 26, for by means of a harlot, a man is reduced to a crust of bread. And people who are falling victim to these types of things, that's how they feel. I mean, they're completely destroyed from the inside out. Even if they haven't destroyed the whole families, which many men have, you're just reduced to nothing because you're an addict just like anybody else. And if you don't deal with that fact and cut off every avenue that can be leading to it, you're going to fall victim to it. You will fall victim. You've got to take God's way of escape.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
And yet, we can't always control what we will see or hear or will pass through our minds. But the key is that it passes through and does not stop and labor there. That's where the trouble really begins to exist.
Yeah.
It's not that Satan got a thought in my head. I saw something, I dwelled on it. And that's where the slippery slope is. And that's the hardest thing to curb.
Yeah.
Because there's nobody talking to you. They could be talking to you and it does no good. Because you are in control of your mind. or you need to be.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in this story in Numbers 25, right? We read into it a little bit right after. So they're executing this judgment, right? They're killing the men, and I assume women that participated in this, right? And they, in the middle of that, in the morning of that, and trying to figure out what to do, this Israelite brings this woman, like just right through the middle of it, right? Like even sometimes when we're trying to solve this out, right? This Midianite woman in our mind just comes through, right? And then we have to finish that, right? We have to go in that, you know? Like if they just had stopped right there and let that pass through, it would have just continued to feed that mindset.
One thing I always told Ian, that if you're out at the store, you're like at Target, and you come across a really attractive, like improperly dressed girl, that's not a problem. It's when you find a will to take the second look. Because if you come across it, that's one thing. But if you find a way to look down the other aisle when she goes to the next aisle, when you walk by, and make sure that you turn your head to see if you catch a glimpse of her, that's when it becomes a problem. You know, a lot of people think that you have to be 100% perfect and you can't see it. It's going to happen. You're going to encounter things. It's what you do with what you encounter. Do you control yourself and go the right way, or do you start to fall prey and look back?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I think a big encouragement for me every time I'm thinking about this is 1 Corinthians 9, chapter just before this. And Paul is just expressing how radically you have to choose spirit over flesh every time the choice comes up. It's always going to be spirit over flesh. I have the right to eat whatever food I want to. I have the right to marry if I want to. But I put all of it aside for the sake of the spirit. And then it ends at the end with the passage about, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? It talks about the imperishable prize. And then verse 27 is a big encouragement to me. But I discipline my body and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So in all those examples, we have a choice on whether we let the flesh win or whether we're going to let our spirit rule our flesh. And it's a big encouragement to me to know that Paul was radical in that, and that he made no provision for the flesh. That took discipline, that took premeditated thought and action, but he was on top of it because he knew what it could lead to.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've had some good comments. I was just going to say, on the good side, this isn't actually a sinful nature issue. God has given us a way to satisfy that pride. And so as Christian men, if we drink water from our own cistern, if we focus on our wives the way that we should, and the husband and the wife are working in tandem the way that they should, this doesn't have to be a difficult issue. You still have some challenges, and that's where we have to get into 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, bringing every thought captive. But we have a way to solve this issue that God gave us. It's when we go outside of the path He gave us that we get into really difficult problems.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, making those decisions when you're young prevents a lot of problems later.
Yeah.
I'd like to amplify what Shane was alluding to. C.S. Lewis has been known to say that a lot of people see someone like Christ and say, he never sinned, he doesn't get it. And the exact opposite is true. Because he never gave in once, because he always resisted, he is the most tested of all of us, because the rest of us capitulated to sin. Time and again. We don't know what it's like to be tempted to the degree Jesus was, because we never got even close to that. And so back to Shane's point, when you are in those circumstances, as C.S. Lewis also said, we are making constant choices of the smallest nature glancing down the aisle the second time. And when you learn to not do that, time and again, you make the right choice. You couldn't avoid the first time. You didn't know when you turned down the aisle the first time she'd be there. But when you followed her down the aisle the next time, you knew better. And so when you make the right choice, and you do that time after time after time after time, you develop that ability to resist, to not succumb, not be as tempted by it. And that's not true with this sin alone, with all matters.
Eddie?
There was a story I heard a long time ago, an illustration about a parent that was about to punish their child for something they did, and the child said, well, I didn't mean to. And the parent said, yes, but you didn't mean not to either. And a lot of times when it comes to these types of sins, we wait till we're in the moment to hopefully react the right way. But we're not supposed to be ignorant of how Satan works. We know how he gets us. We know when he gets us. If you took a 2-week period of time with whatever sin you're dealing with and just write down the times and what was going on when it happened, you would see a pattern. You know how it happens. And so we need to develop a plan before those things happen to us so that I know how to react. I mean, we're supposed to put on the armor before we're in the battle. Don't wait for the battle to be there. And so I think that's one of the most important things to do, is because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when we're going to happen upon these types of situations and circumstances, but we can predetermine how we're going to react. And that's what we have to do, is mean to not.
Sports we talk about all the time, we want to practice in a certain way that ultimately we cannot do it any other way. And we have a chance every day to pray every day, to study every day, to follow Christ every day, to meditate on his word every day, associate with other fellow Christians every day. Well, after a while, that's the only way. You're doing it over and over and over. You avoid these pitfalls. You avoid these situations. And if you do get in a situation, you're so well practiced, I know what to do now, and you do it immediately. You don't have to think, well, what should I do? Okay, well, it's too late. In sports, it's too late. And our Christian lives, we don't want it to be too late.
Yes, sir. Okay, so we had some real good discussion on that. We've only got 13 minutes left, but we can go a little long, I guess. But so I'd like to move on a little bit, but highlight a couple points. Some of these y'all kind of hit on the sliding scale, right? We don't want to let, however corrupt and immoral our society gets, we don't want to slide down that, right? The standard's up here. We don't want to drift in any way towards the evils that are around us. The other thing I was thinking about is this backdoor approach that Moab uses, right? Instead of the full frontal assault with their army up front, instead they're going to try to trick them and bring them and weaken them that way, right? We've got to watch for that, not just with ourselves, but in our families. And like Trey was talking about, that we'll get to a little bit later too. You know, if we think we've got that strong front and we've got our defenses set, we need to continue to watch and continue to be aware of backdoor problems, right? You know, there's always, we see this right in movies, especially for kids, they're constantly trying to slip these things in. And for the most part of our society, if there's something just obnoxiously in your face, a lot of times people won't go see that movie, but there's still little backdoor things that'll slip in there that those movies may still get a lot of views, right? And those just slowly wear down on society. The same thing can happen on us as well. Let's see. Okay, so let's talk about verse 9. So all that was for one verse. Very good, everybody. 1 Corinthians 10:9, if someone wouldn't mind reading that real quickly.
Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents.
Yeah, and so this is from Numbers 21. Numbers 21, these fiery serpents, right? So Numbers 21 and verse 4, it says, Then they set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to bypass the land of Edom. But the people became impatient because of the journey. The people spoke against God and Moses, why have you led us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread or water, and we detest this wretched food." Then the Lord sent poisonous snakes among the people, and they bit them so that many Israelites died. The people then came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord so that he will take the snakes away from us." And Moses interceded for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake image and mount it on a pole. When anyone who is bitten looks at it, he will recover." So Moses made a bronze snake and mounted it on a pole. Whenever someone was bitten and he looked at the bronze snake, he recovered. Okay, so this word in 1 Corinthians 10:9, it's a little bit different. It seems to be a little bit different word than the typical word for try or test. It's Strong's number 1598. It means to test thoroughly or tempt, with the outcome of testing to an extreme, unwarranted degree. It's a hyper test, going to improper measure, which exceeds appropriate boundaries, and pushing the one tested beyond reasonable or proper limits. Right? So it's not really just tested. It's like extremely exhaustive test, right? And it's only used a couple other times in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. It's what Jesus answers and says, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." It's that word there when he's answering the devil about turning the, I believe that's about turning the, no, that wouldn't be the bread to stone. I think it's when he wants him to jump off the temple, that you're not to put the Lord to the test. It's also in Luke 10, I believe, where the lawyer comes to him to test him. And asks this question. It's an extreme test. It's to an unwarranted degree, right? And so we see here that, I'll kind of just answer some of my questions I have, but we see that Israel, they're testing God with their just extreme impatience. And if you back up in the chapter in Numbers 21, they had just had this victory over a Canaanite king in the Negev, which is kind of South Judah, or what would be South Judah. They destroy their cities, and then instead of like just continuing up through that way, God sends them way around the land of the Edomites, right? So you could kind of see like, well, look, we just won. Can't we just keep going? Like, why are we going way around here? I don't get it, right? And so they're impatient, they're complaining. And so one of the questions I have is, what does excessive questioning and complaining tell the person that has authority over us? What are we saying to that person when we're just constantly impatient with decisions that are made and constant complaints about what's made or what's done?
Faith.
Oh.
No, I have no faith in you.
Yeah, no faith in you. What were you going to say?
I don't think putting the Lord to the test is necessarily bad, because I think about Malachi 3. It says, "Bring the full tithe, test me and see if I can open up windows from heaven," right?
Yeah.
Or, when Jesus asked Peter to put down the nets again, he says, "I don't know, Lord, but I'll go with you." So having doubts and putting the Lord to the test maybe isn't the worst thing, but we have to take that step of faith in his direction rather than that step of doubt in the opposite direction. The problem here is they don't have faith in the Lord. They backtrack and go another direction that he hasn't authorized. And so I think putting our foot out and not being sure and asking the Lord to show us is maybe the worst thing, but we have to do that in his direction with faith.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a big difference between going, kind of disappointed that we're going back around and, talking to God from a humble position, right? Like, well, I don't understand why.
But I'm going to do it.
Right, yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do whatever you say, but I don't understand this, right?
I think their attitude shown in verse 5 when they say, "For there is no food," and then in that same sentence, "except for this worthless bread."
Right, yeah.
So you have no food, or you do have bread.
Right.
And that's the thing, is that you see people's attitude a lot of times, and the thing that they're complaining about is that, it shows they don't have trust in you as a leader a lot of times, or they think that their way is the best. And most of the time it shows that they're either discouraged or they're afraid. And that seems like what it is here is this is where they're putting God to the test, is that God has led you. He has brought you through this land. Whether he tells you to go the long way or the short way, you still need to go that way. And think about when Jesus told his disciples, let's get in the boat and go to the other side. And then the storm comes up. I heard a point that was made about that was really good. They had enough faith to believe that if Jesus was awake, he could save them. But they didn't have enough faith to believe that he could keep them from being destroyed while he was asleep. And that's one of the things that I think it is that a lot of times we want God to rescue us from the situation instead of being secure that God is not leading you in a way that's going to destroy you. You might be hungry, you might be tired, you might be thirsty, but he's not going to let you starve or thirst or wear yourself out to death. So I think that's where the real test is that do we believe in God or not? And the complaining puts me at the center of all the attention. And most of the time that I know in leadership that I've seen, most of the time that's what's happening is that person is putting themselves as the center of attention. And they may try to play it off as a concern for others, but 99% of the time it's always about them and what's going on with them.
Yeah, and that's kind of along what I think the answer is to the next question I had, which is what's so enticing about being impatient or complaining? And I think it's that, right? It's, well, I'm clearly the center of the universe, so why aren't things going the way that I want them to? Any other thoughts on either of those questions?
Well, they're basically saying what God is giving isn't sufficient.
Yeah.
And, the Matt point there earlier, that there's a difference between what's happening here and what happened with Paul when he prayed 3 times for the sword to be taken from him. And God said, my grace is sufficient. The answer from God is the exact same. But the approach to God is the difference in these two scenarios. One approach to humbleness and one approach to, look, even this, what you supply us, we don't want it. It's detestable. It's loathsome. We look at it like, what is this? God, give us something better. And when we start looking at God as like, okay, yeah, you gave us our word, the word, but you hadn't spoken to us in 2,000 years, so what else you got, God?
Yeah. Yeah, and something you said there kind of reminded me, like in this story, once they kind of come back to Moses and they repent and they ask him to intercede, they ask him to remove the snakes. And God doesn't remove the snakes, right? But he gives them a way out. And did you make that point Sunday morning in the high school class, Kellen? Okay, good point. Anything else on those?
We've talked about that point here a few times about our prayers, but he's going to answer, but it might not be like, take the snakes away.
Yeah.
Well, he did in a way, but but we have to be looking for the answer and to understand the answer in his way, not our way.
Yeah. Okay, the last question I had on this is, do you see any connections between impatience and complaining and immorality? Are there any common factors in that or any similarities?
Tends to be about the individual.
Yeah, it tends to be about the individual.
I think the common thread is contentment. All three of us, we learn to be content.
Yeah, so the common thread is you're not content. Like if you're impatient, if you're complaining, if you're sexually immoral, you're not content. Yeah, very true.
Well, just like the verse that talks about, someone who lays with a harlot becomes one with the harlot. The one who engages in complaining and murmuring and disputing all the time becomes one with that. It's not that they are murmuring, they are a murmurer. And that's where a lot of danger comes in, because sometimes we are going to have questions about, what is God wanting or expecting, and we may have, feelings like, I'm a little afraid about this. If we're not careful, we become that thing.
Yeah.
Ourselves.
Any other thoughts on that one? Yes, sir.
And with this, and the children of Israel continue to complain over and over again, the word insatiable comes up. It makes me think of that, and the idea is that no matter what is done, they can't be pleased. And
Yeah.
There's a connection with that and the sexual immorality and kind of what Brad was talking about earlier, where one thing is done, but that's not going to be enough. Once you
Yeah.
start down that path, you're not going to be satisfied. You got to have more. And so.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the only other thing that's slightly different is like just a lack of discipline, lack of self-control, right? If you're constantly impatient or constantly complaining, right, you're lacking some control on your really your thoughts, but your words, or in the sexually immoral part, your actions as well, right? Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do before we go is read the whole context of 1 Corinthians 10. So someone would read 1 Corinthians 10, and we'll do 1 through 13.
I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, for most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. And these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages have come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will provide a way of escape, that you may be able to endure it.
Yeah, so I think when you look at the full context here, right, there's some other important lessons and takeaways for us, right? I believe Trey was talking about this, right? They were all under the cloud, right? They all passed through the Red Sea. They were all part of that. They were drinking from the spiritual drink. They were eating the spiritual food, right? They had the spiritual rock, but most of them were not well pleasing to God, right? God was not well pleased with most of them, and they died in the wilderness. Many of us, unfortunately, we might be coming here and we might be drinking these things. We might be eating these things. We might be hearing the word of God. But that doesn't mean that we're well-pleasing, right? We've got to look at what is our attitude and what is our thoughts and what are our actions apart from that, right? Do I truly love God here, or do I have some sort of idol? That's kind of the next thing he goes into, and it's really the immediate context of the verses we're looking at, right? Verse 7, do not be idolaters, right? And so you can kind of see another strong connection to these other two, sexual immorality and testing the Lord and grumbling, right? Which is idolatry. There's something that I'm loving more than God. Maybe it's myself. Maybe it's that woman. Maybe it's whatever. Maybe it's money. It could be any number of things, right, that fit into that category and follow this same pattern. And so, right, he says, these things were written for us so that we would learn not to crave these things. So it's important that we remember these lessons from the past. It's important that we avoid these, as he says, not act this way. We're not going to act that way. I thought of the example in Proverbs 7 about the young man. He looks out of his window and sees this young man, and he kind of like the woman in the grocery aisle, right? He goes by her way. He's getting as close as he can to this, and then she entices him in, right? So we've got to avoid those things. Just because you're avoiding them, we've got to check the ego, take heed if we think we stand. Verse 12, right? We've got to be careful to not think that just because we're doing well that we will always do well and we can let our guard down and not watch those backdoor ways of things slipping in for us or our family or our congregation. And then lastly, verse 13, this beautiful passage about how he'll give us a way out. You know, there's always this way out. You know, if you've struggled with these things, there's a way back, and we can help you with that.
I think that's important to emphasize. The provision of the way of escape is the escape from sinning, not the removal of the temptation.
Yes.
Because he says, so you will be able to endure it. We think he'll take away the temptation. I don't really think so. I've lived 65 years. I'm telling you, he doesn't remove as many temptations as we think he should.
Yeah.
What he's telling us is, you're going to be able to endure it if you'll find the way of escape.
Yes. Any other thoughts on that? Or maybe we didn't talk too much about idolatry, but how idolatry kind of connects in with all this. Any thoughts there? Yes, sir.
Not on the idolatry,
Oh, okay.
but I kind of look at verse 22, going back to the verse about, not testing the Lord. And basically, 22 is, are you stronger than the Lord? It's a realistic question.
Yeah. No, that's a good thought. Any other thoughts before we end? Bobby?
Last thought. A lot of this has to do with idolatry. Everything is filling an appetite. Sexual immorality is all filling an appetite. What stomach are you feeding?
Yeah.
And so, a little different issue, but of the same issue is the Romans 13 or 14, when they're talking about not causing another to stumble. And it says in verse 20, do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. And so you think, well, what's the work of God? Well, then you can flip over to Ephesians 2, and it's really easy. It says, we are the workmanship. Who? We. All of those who, as we learn, have the right now to be called children of God, are his workmanship. Who are we destroying? We're destroying God's workmanship by doing it. So it's not just a sliding the bar. It's not a game we're playing. It's not, we'll do better later. You're destroying God's workmanship.
Yeah.
For the sake of food, for the sake of filling an appetite, that carnal, worldly appetite, whatever it be.
Yeah, and that fits a broad category. No, that's a great point. And you're not just destroying yourself. You're likely destroying your family. You're destroying maybe even your congregation, maybe even your nation, right? You're contributing to that as well. All right, Bobby said that was the last comment, but does anybody want to trump that? I thought you would.
On the same vein of idolatry, I mean, we're looking at an example from Numbers 21 that looks to us like idolatry. I mean, we think, okay, a bronze serpent up on a pole, that really has the tone of idol worship or something. The difference is, it's what God said to do.
Right.
So idolatry is doing what we think is the better idea. It's not like they made up the statue and they put it up on a pole. And even Jesus uses that exact same example in John 3, 14 and 15, where he says, just as the serpent was lifted up on a pole, so will I be. And I think it really ties back into verse 11. All these things happened to them as examples, as they were written for our admonition, and they were written for our admonition, admonishment, there you go, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. The point of all of it is to go back to what God tells us to look at, not at all what the world tells us to look at. I mean, really, idolatry is looking to whatever we think is better, or whatever we think will do better for us. It's so many things that we forget God's picture, or his plan, or his purpose. If we decide something is better than looking at what God told us to look at, then that can become the idol. I think Mitchell's example a minute ago was spot on. I mean, it's really hard to keep your mind in the gutter looking at Scripture. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're having a problem, if you're walking down the aisle or whatever, and it's like, okay, I need 20 seconds to reset or whatever, and you just pop a Bible verse or open your phone and read it. I mean, it doesn't take very long for us to get, squirrel, so.
Yeah.
But, and I use that funny, but at the same time, Scripture can do that to us too. It can put us back on the track that we need to be on, so we're not wrapped up in because we are surrounded by potential idols. So anything that we let distract us from God, it is really an idol, and we have to constantly. And it doesn't even have to be sexual immorality. It could be riches and wealth and cars. I mean, pick it, whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, no, great point.
Last thought either.
He said that was his last thought. No one else can say one. So. Okay. Anything else? All right. Could I get a volunteer for a closing prayer? Trey.
Great God, Father, we praise you for your faithfulness, always providing us a way out, providing us instruction to direct our feet. Please help us free from sexual immorality. Help us flee from idolatry. Help us and humble us if needed. Amen.
Thank y'all.